Hi y'all. In this slideshow I'm going to talk briefly about the 15 valid argument forms and their Venn diagrams. And what's sort of interesting is that although that there are 15 valid forms, there's really just sort of 8 Venn diagrams. So some of the valid forms sort of share the same Venn diagram picture, and that's because some of the sentences are symmetrical, which is to say, even if you flip the order of the subject and the predicate, you still get the same picture. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we go on forward, but I just wanted to make this short video to talk about that. Okay, so we're going to start with syllogisms, valid syllogisms that have all universal claims. So there's sort of two situations that you could potentially get a valid argument. One is where everything is a universal. The other is where you have one premise that's universal and another premise that is a particular and a conclusion that is particular. So we'll do those after this. But to start, there are 5 forms, valid forms that are all universal, and only one has the conclusion that all S are P. So only one has a universal affirmative conclusion, and that's the Barber argument. It's called the Barber argument because of all the vowels in the name Barbara are A's. So this is an argument that is made up of all A claims. So if I go to this first premise, we see that all MRP is an A claim, and if we draw the Venn diagram of that, we'll have this area shaded in. So universal affirmatives, and if we go to the second premise here is also an A claim, and if we draw the Venn diagram of that, it looks like this. So this crescent gets shaded in, and remember that shading means empty. So if these two premises are true, the conclusion, if these two premises are true, then these areas of the Venn diagram would be empty. And then, so those are the two premises, and this is the only way to get the conclusion that all S are P. So it's the only way to get an A conclusion. The only way to fill in this area of the Venn diagram. So if the conclusion is true, then that area would be empty, and that is the only way to do it. The only sort of valid form that has a universal affirmative. Okay, so there are 4 forms that have as a conclusion a universal negative, and that is when you have sort of one A claim and one E claim. So universal affirmative and a universal negative together can get you a universal negative. So I just gotta find my pen here. Here it is. So what's interesting though is that there are 4 forms where this happens, but the Venn diagram for these forms, there's only 2 Venn diagrams for these forms. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why you get the same sort of Venn diagram picture for different forms. So let's start over here on the left. You'll notice that you've got an E, a universal negative, and the E is slightly different in both of these arguments here. So the one on the top left here is no MRP, and the one on the bottom left is no PRM. Um, so the order of the terms have been switched, but with universal negatives, that's not going to change the picture, because what you do to diagram universal negatives is that you shade in an overlap, and so the overlap is going to be the same no matter sort of what the order of the terms for the universal negative. So in this case, the overlap is this one over here on the right. And it just doesn't matter if it's all P or M, excuse me, no P or M, or no M or P, it's going to be the same picture. So there's a symmetry. Now, with the universal affirmative, however, you don't have that symmetry. So universal affirmatives or A claims are asymmetrical. So you can't switch the order without changing the picture. So in this case, you need all SRM in order to do this right. So in both forms, it's the order is the same, all SRM. And but you take those two together, and that's one way to get the conclusion that no SRM, that the conclusion in both of these is no SRP. Sorry, I think I said no SRM there. So it says so no SRP is what you're looking for as the conclusion, which is a universal negative. And again, if that conclusion is true, then this overlap in the middle would be shaded in. I'm just going to indicate that here with the green, and it is. So that means this argument is valid. Okay, over here on the right, we have another a pair of forms where we have a universal negative and a universal affirmative. But in this case, we have kind of switched which premise gets the universal negative and which gets the universal affirmative. So in this case, the P premise is the universal affirmative, and the S premise is the universal negative. So now the P is the A claim, and the S is the E claim. So if we do, and then the E claim, of course, is the same kind of situation where the terms have been switched. So we have no SRM in the top right one, and no MRS in the bottom right one. But that doesn't matter for the picture because it's symmetrical, and so you get that shape shaded in. And then with the universal affirmative, it does have to be the same order because it's asymmetrical, and so it's this over here. So there you have it. If you shade in those two areas and you look at the conclusion, which is no SRP, another universal negative, that is sort of another way, and the only other way, to get this overlap shaded in. So 4 forms that will shade in the S and P overlap. So 4 forms that will get you no SRP, but actually only 2 pictures, only 2 diagrams, because of that symmetry. All right, so moving on, we now have the forms where one of the premises is universal, and one of the premises is a particular,
and the conclusion is a particular. So we're going to have some x's now, and the first form that we're going to talk about is the EIO form, where the universal negative is one of the premises, and in this case uh, it's the P premise, and then the universal, the particular affirmative is the I premise, and is another premise, and then a particular negative is the conclusion. And there's actually 4 ways to sort of do this, but it'll all be the same picture. So we only need sort of one diagram to talk about all 4 of these patterns. Uh, and so we'll start with the negative, the universal negative. So with these forms, you always diagram the universal first. So we have a universal negative in all 4 of these forms. So E, 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 E. And the only difference is in some of these forms is that sometimes the terms have been switched. So again, this is a situation with the E claims where no matter the order of the term, you're going to get the sort of same picture. So sometimes you have no MRP, and sometimes you have no PRM. So either way, you're going to get the same picture. You're going to get this area, this overlap sort of shaded in. So this area will be empty. And so if you do that, and then you go to the particular premise, because remember you always do the particular after the universal, the particular premise is an I claim, which is also symmetrical, because when you do an I claim, you put an X in an overlap, right? So instead of shading an overlap, you're saying that there's at least one thing in the overlap, and in this case, we're putting it in the overlap on the left. So on the left here, there are 2 options, but one of them has been sort of shaded in. So the only other place that an X could go, if you wanted to put in the left overlap or the S and M overlap, it would go right here. And so, and this is the same picture for either some MRS or some SRM, so it doesn't matter the order, you're going to get the same picture. And so you end up with 4 different forms where this is the picture that you get. So now, and this is a way to get the conclusion that some S are not P. So the conclusion is the same in all of these, and it has to be the same because the O claim is asymmetrical, so the order actually sort of matters with the asymmetrical forms. And so the conclusion is that there's at least one S that isn't a P, and in this case, what you would be looking for then is an X that's in the S circle but not in the P circle, and here it is. So circled in green is an S that isn't a P, right? So it's in the S circle and not in the P circle. So 4 ways to get that, but the same picture in all 4 cases. Okay, so we're moving on to some forms that will get you the particular affirmative, so some SRP, and they all have an A claim, a universal affirmative, as a premise, and then a a particular affirmative as a premise, and then the conclusion, as I mentioned, is a particular affirmative. So you have 4 forms where you can do this, but 2 different pictures. So there's a overlap, but not quite as much overlap as we had sort of previously. So we'll start over here on the left. Our universal affirmative is the A claim. So remember that A claims are asymmetrical, so you can't just sort of switch the order without switching the picture. So in this case, you are doing all M are P. So all M are P looks like this. You push all the M's into the P circle. So this area is empty. And then you can go ahead and do your affirmative. So the particular affirmative in this case is some SRM or some MRS. So again, remember that with I claims, they're symmetrical. So even if you switch the order, you're still going to get the same picture. So what we need is an X that's in the S and M overlap, and you'll notice that half of it's been shaded in. So the only other place for it to go is right here. So ends up being in all the overlaps as a result, but that's the only place for it to go, for it to be both an S and an M. But now if we look at the conclusion, you'll see that it's also a P. So it's an S, a P, and an M. So yes, indeed, it is the case that there is at least one S that is a P. So you have an X in the S and P overlap. So that means that the argument is valid. Okay, so moving on to the pictures on the right. It's the same kind of deal. It's just that now you've switched which premise is the universal and which is the particular. So now the S premise is the universal and the P premise is the particular. But you still do universals first, so we'll just keep the red here for the universal. But we're going to change where we're pushing everything here. So all M are S instead of all M are P. So we're pushing everything into the S circle now instead of the P circle. And then when it comes to our particular affirmative, we're going to be putting things, our X into the right overlap, the P and M overlap. But again, because half of that has been shaded in, the only place that it can go is right in the middle. And of course, if you do that, you end up making it an S. So again, same kind of situation where you end up with an S that is a P. So there's at least one S that's a P. So the conclusion is guaranteed. The argument is valid. All right, so the last two forms, this will get us to 15 here. The last two forms involve universal affirmatives and particular negatives. And these are sort of unique because of the asymmetry. So universals affirmatives are asymmetrical, and so are particular negatives. And so you only have one picture for both of these forms. So we'll start over here on the left. We've got another universal affirmative, all M are S. That pushes everything into the S circle from the M circle, so that area is empty. And then the particular negative here is some M are not P, so that's an O, and this one's kind of, for whatever reason, is always kind of trips me up. So some M are not P. It's got to go in the M crescent that's not part of the overlap, and but half of it's been sort of shaded in, so the only place left for it to go is down here. So that's an M that isn't a P. So that's the only place for it to go. And if you do that, you end up with the conclusion, right? You end up with an S that isn't a P. So it's an S that isn't excuse me, it's an M that isn't a P, but it's also an S that isn't a P. So the conclusion is guaranteed, so the argument is valid. All right, so the other form, where this AOO form, is all PRM. So that's the universal affirmative here. So all PRM looks like this, sort of pushing all the P's into the M circle. And then if we do that, then we go on to the particular negative, some S are not M. So now we're putting it down here in the bottom left, but part of it has been sort of shaded in, so the only place left for it to go is down here. And if you do that, well, that is an S. That isn't a P. So the conclusion is some S are not P. So here we go, an S that isn't a P. So there we have it. All 15 forms, but only 8 pictures. And I don't know if that will help, but here they are.